So now what we'll have is a round table of 4 really brave synthesizers who will provide us more or less an 8-minute sort of synthetic kind of conversation, throw out questions and things like that. And then we'll invite the speakers to respond if there's any sort of particular thing lodged to the speakers. Do I have, I'm missing 2 speakers. Where are my other speakers? Are they not here? They're outside. Okay. Julie, are you hunting? Are you going to go hunt? Okay. We don't play. Yeah. Yeah. She's mean with a crossbow too. So then we'll invite the speakers to respond. But then we really want to open it up, and we really want to invite people's. You can follow up on a question you didn't get to ask to somebody, or follow up on some of the threads that our roundtable discussants have offered, or other things that come up. That's why we laboriously moved all these chairs and delinked them and things like that, was to sort of create this. Okay, so I would love all speakers to be here because your remarks are going to address them. So I'm not, if you can open to the page, if you can open to the bios, because we've printed you out these nice bios, I'm actually not going to simply regurgitate what's on them, which is what I would probably have to do sort of for most of them anyway, but I can start right now by saying, do you care what order, people? Like, does it matter? You have no. You do not want to go last. And who's a volunteer for going last? Okay. Okay. Let me see the order we're listed on. Okay, I tell you what, I'll stick with what's here. Okay, that way people can match you up. They can match you up with this. I'll just introduce them and then we'll go down. So briefly, Kaji Amin is currently at Stony Brook in gender, sexuality, and what's it called? Like women's gender, sexuality studies, okay? Jershan Aviles is at down the road at UNC Chapel Hill in English, right? Yes, English and Comp Lit. Okay. Stephanie Foote is currently you're at West Virginia? Is that right? West Virginia? Yes, West Virginia. That's good.
I just moved, so
Yeah. Okay, I'm here to tell you, you're at West Virginia. Well, right now you're at Duke, but you'll probably go back to West Virginia, sort of university. And then who, sort of graciously agreed to go last, our own Diane Nelson, who's here in cultural anthropology. Okay, so I have 3 out of 4 presenters. So I think we'll, just in the name of time, I think that we'll go ahead and then, oh good, she got her. You didn't use your crossbow. Okay. Okay.
the mics.
Okay, yeah, okay, she's gonna check the mics. So can we come up and, can we place you somewhere up here? Okay, that's great. All right, and so we're gonna go in the order that I said of Kaji, Jershan, Stephanie, Diane. Kaji?
So I think that instead of do kind of
Closer.
is this on? Yeah. Instead of trying to tie everything together, I'm gonna, still? Hello? Is this better? Okay, I'll hold it up to my mouth. So instead of trying to tie everything together, I wanted to just offer a kind of a connection between something that Amelia Jones said and something that I've been thinking of, which is the relationship between queer and trans studies, right? So I think it often gets posed as a progress narrative where you move from feminist to queer and then to trans, and the progress narrative is also temporal. So trans emerges later than queer, and queer emerges later than feminist. And so I've become interested in thinking about instead entanglements and resonances between these, and actually how certain dynamics within certain fields get mimicked and repeated within other fields without necessarily recognizing that these dynamics have been inherited from this prior field formation. So, so I'm still kind of thinking through how this is in the midst of happening within trans studies. So I'll just offer you some of my thoughts here. So, so first of all, a kind of important anchoring point in trans studies was a moment when trans scholars began critiquing what they saw as a kind of move they saw certain feminist or feminist queer scholars making which was using the versions of the trans body, and particularly drag or butch femme, right? Butch in particular, as ways of asking the question of whether this was a form of gender fluidity that got us outside of the gender binary, something that allowed us to critique essentialist ideas about gender or detach masculinity and femininity from male and female bodies, or rather something that was complicit in these formations, right? So there was a kind of debate within the 1990s that became exhausted, I think, which was about looking at whether things like butch femme formations were either complicit or resistant in dominant or hegemonic gender, right? And I think in the academy during this time, that kind of debate was being replayed in lots of different sites. So that at one point, Eve Sedgwick within Queer Studies says, well, kind of subversive, kind of, complicit. That ends up being the conclusion of just about everything. So there started to be a kind of exhaustion with that kind of effort to determine whether something was complicit or not. But in trans studies in particular, there was a move to say, okay, the utility of the trans or the non-gender conforming or the body and drag for queer studies or for feminist studies is primarily in order to say that this proves our ideas about gender, right? Or so it reaffirms a kind of existing frame of critique, right? Or it's even idealized as what gets us outside of this frame of binary gender. And so, but it's never thought of on its own terms, right? So the framework is already pre-given, and the only options are, to state the critique, right? The only options are either subversion or complicity. And so a kind of founding critique was to say we need to look on their own terms at trans subjects, right? Trans epistemologies, trans cultures, and so on. And so that I think, and then in a kind of progression from there, there's sometimes the sense that that's something that we've already done in trans studies. So we're beyond this moment of just idealizing the trans body as what critiques dominant gender, right? But in reality, I think we see this move kind of being, or this a kind of tension constantly being replayed in trans studies between wanting to locate within trans some subversive potential that does something radically new with gender, right? And between wanting to be, versus, I would say, wanting to be accountable to real transgender subjects, right? Which may have certain desires for certain forms of normativity, or which may create gendered cultures that are different from, hegemonic gender, but that still have abide by certain kind of rules, so to speak. So that I think has remained a tension, that oscillation between a radical trans and a kind of desire to be accountable to trans. And so one dynamic that I think this replays within queer studies is is a kind of what Michael Warner has called subjectless critique, right? So using queer not as a term that refers to an identity or to a specific subculture or to a specific sexuality, but as a term that refers to something, you might think of it as the kind of deconstructive aspect of queer, that is some kind of deconstructive energy, right? Or some kind of troubling of boundaries between things or of categories, whatever they may be, right? Or queer simply as a kind of critique of heteronormativity, right? So queer is a subjectless critique that's not bound by particular persons or particular political histories or something like that. So that's given great energy to queer studies as something that gets to be both about sexuality and also gets to move outside of it whenever it's convenient or sexuality becomes too unappealing of an object because of its complicities, right? So I think that move to subjectless critique, it's also been replicated with some degrees of success in other fields, for instance, within Native studies, as a critique of settler colonialism, rather than as saying, well, we're going to give you positive knowledge about this particular indigenous tribe, right? And so that's a tactic that has been copied in some fields. So trans studies, I think, also takes up that subjectless critique in a version of, I guess, prefixal trans, right? So where you focus on trans as a prefix in a way that allows you to say, okay, we're not necessarily always talking about transgender as a specific kind of identity, right? Or as a specific person, but we're interested in trans as a prefix that could attach to a number of things, right? It could be transnational, trans species, and so on and so forth. And so there was a moment where it seemed like this was a tactic for generating conferences, right? So there would be the trans conference where you would have transgender, transnational, trans species, and everything all in one, right? And there was a lot of kind of hope and optimism in trans as a prefix then, as that would allow us to escape from these various fields with their fixed objects of study and so on, right? So that came together in these umbrella trans conferences. But at the same time, I think it created it opened the possibility for the creation of a body of work that was really interested in thinking transgender along with other forms of crossings, right? So some of that scholarship has focused on really interesting conjunctures, like Riley Snorton's work on passing, for instance, among African Americans in relation to passing as another gender, right? Or Seema Shaksari's work on transgender refugees from Iran in the space of Turkey, right? So it has sometimes come together in really specific ways that have been interesting for scholarship. So in terms of this prefixal trans, I think that there are moments when, especially when you look at kinds of introductions to special issues or pieces that are functioning as a kind of little manifesto, right, for what trans studies should do. And I think these are always problematic and difficult genres to work in, right, where you have to stake a claim for why this field of study has the right to exist, or what's so interesting about it, or what it can deliver that's intellectually new, right? So there's always the effort to try to say what's new about what's happening in this field. But I've noticed two kinds of moves that tend to happen in those kinds of pieces about what's so special about trans. And one, I think, tends to pose trans as the new queer, right? So it's trans as, and this is kind of interesting because when transgender first emerged as a term in the 1990s, as opposed to transsexual, what it emerged from was really a queer critique of transsexuality as a kind of medical construct with a predetermined life narrative, right? So there is a queer origin of that version of transgender anyhow. But in this version, it's almost as if the critiques of subjectless critique, right? That it elides its object of study, and that in the process it might tend to reify certain kinds of privileged subjects, right? That those critiques tend to get passed over in posing trans as a better version of this kind of boundary crossing and boundary troubling work that queer was once supposed to do. And then, so another version, or another kind of argument for what's new about trans is sometimes that it's almost, so this comes from the prefixal trans, that we're going to consider trans as a prefix with all these other different kinds of variables together and not just transgender, right? So I think that there, trans becomes a kind of newer form of intersectionality, right? Where there's this injunction to think about different forms of difference together, right? And especially forms of crossing together. So I guess my interest in noting these kind of resonances and repetitions is to think about intellectual genealogy differently as something that's not a progress narrative, and also as a way of bringing into trans studies some of the still ongoing critiques of intersectionality and ongoing critiques of queer, right? So that we can take those on and see what they do in this particular kind of context. So I'll just end there. Okay, I have to clap now.
Okay, is this close enough? Does this work? Okay. Well, I just want to start by saying it's been a real pleasure to be able to be here the past 2 days and listen to all the talks and not closer. Wow. Okay, in my mouth. So I've really enjoyed listening to talks, but I have to say I've been especially riveted by the Q&A sessions that we've heard the past couple of days. I've been trying to think about, I wrote out my notes so I wouldn't forget anything. I've been trying to think about how to offer a response to all that I've witnessed over the past 48 hours or so. And I've returned to the question that Professor Wald used to frame her introductory thoughts yesterday. What do we mean by theory now? The four speakers are taking us in different directions in attempting to answer this provocative question. The love of labor and work literature's attempt to make work the side of subjectivity, disability and pain, and the refusal of redemption narratives, essentialism in and feminism, and the problem of the pervasiveness of the algorithm. Inspired by what I've heard, I want to talk about two particular issues: genealogy and where is theory. I saw a significant emphasis on method in both Professor McKittrick's talk and in Professor Jones's. To add to this recurring consideration of methodology, I want to put some emphasis on the field in which I work, queer of color critique. Queer of color critique is a method that seeks to imagine the kinds of alternatives I think McKittrick is looking for in her particular field. And as I will discuss, it belongs in a genealogy rooted in the 1970s, mirroring the lineage Professor Jones lays out. Genealogy emerged so prominently for me in Jones's talk. I was inspired by this impulse to think aloud today about queer of color critique's genealogy. Talking about queer of color critique means talking about what feminist theory was, is, or can be. Queer of color critique, as Roderick Ferguson's work especially demonstrates, has its roots in feminism, especially Black feminist thought. Thinkers such as Patricia Hill Collins, but also earlier thinkers such as Barbara Smith and the poet Cheryl Clarke, laid the foundation for the area of study that would become queer of color critique. Part of my point here is that it's not just that queer of color critique is rooted in Black and women of color feminism, but Black lesbian feminism is at the heart of this formation. So not only might we think about queer of color, this one's better. Okay. Oh, wow, yeah. I really hear myself now. Yeah. So not only might we, wow, this is too close. So not only might we think about queer of color critique as an outgrowth of feminist thought, we might need to keep in the foregrounds of our minds the centrality of Black queerness to important feminist thought. And in other words, I'm also trying to point out not only this genealogy that will move us from 1980s Black feminism to queer of color critique, but similarly that there is not a progressive linear narrative. There's a back and forth there. There's a way in which queerness is always already there, right, embedded in Black feminist thought. I cited as an example Barbara Smith's important anthology, Homegirls. This text attempts to collect ruminations of feminism, document Black queer life, and think through racism and sexism in the context of political activism, making it a key text both in feminist thought and queer of color critique, even if it's more often cited occasionally than actually examined. To think through the question, where is feminist theory now, sometimes we have to remind ourselves of where it comes from, or perhaps, put better, where we assume it comes from. Only then might we be able to reconsider our presumptions and chart new lines of flight. Even though I've been putting pressure on the framing question, listening to Professor Weeks and Crosby forced me to reconsider the construction of the question. Instead of thinking about what do we mean by theory now, I began to ponder, where do we look for theory? Like Professor McKittrick, I wonder what happens when we turn to the work of art, not as the object of critique, but as the conduit of theorizing. I offer as a brief example the work of African-American visual artist and feminist Howardina Pindell. And when I was thinking, I was like, it'd be great if I could show you the image, but I can't. But I'll describe the image I'm talking about, or the series I'm talking about, and how I think it stands as art that's doing some really important theoretical work. So she has a series from the early 1970s called the Untitled series. And I talk about her work in my book, and I think it's really, but her work kept coming to my mind over the past 2 days. And in each and every talk, for some reason, my mind went to her art. In her Untitled series, she takes sheets of paper and punches holes into them. And then she attaches these punch circles with a spray adhesive and a confetti-like layer onto sewn sheets of graph paper, so that what you see is graph paper with confetti all over it, and the confetti are often numbered, or you can see the sewing that's happened on the pages. The punch holes and the worked canvas, showing evidence of having been sewn, heavily textured with paint, and physically manipulated, function to make present Pindell's labor-intensive procedure in creating. The art is absolutely, as I said, non-representational. There aren't bodies there. There's not even any kind of figuration that happens in this particular series. However, non-representational paintings, these paintings offer up Pindel's laboring body. I read this work in the context of 1970s feminism and her critique about the absenting of Black artists in the art world. Pindel is able to put forward a rendering of the body at work. She suggests the value of rethinking how one might represent the body. One might refuse representation because of fetishism or because of an overwhelming call to produce the Black body, but still place a political value on making the body appear, or at least making the viewer face the reality of Black women's labor without relying on visual codes that seek to redeem the Black female body from the reality of historic laboring. What do I mean when I talk about theory now, to return to the opening question? I mean this work of art I've just been describing, this series, this Untitled series, as well as the need to study those activists and thinkers who help make possible critical theory, but are not taken up in our discussions about the state of theory.
Is this working? Good. I did not write anything out. I'm very sorry to say. Thank you for having me at this conference. I learned so much from all of the papers, and in the seminar that we were just in before this, some of the people said, oh, I really hate when seminar leaders ask us to process what we've heard because it just takes a really long time. And I thought, you will have your revenge shortly. And here it is. It is very hard to process all this. And I actually, I come to it in part through what I do now, which is the environmental humanities. And some of what the environmental humanities is doing is returning to old questions of materialism and taking the agency of objects, including our own bodies, seriously, and trying to redistribute how we think about agency in order to think about the other key terms in environmental humanities, which do almost never include nature, but usually include culture, circulation, globalization, resource extraction, capitalism, scale, and time. One of the things that I was thinking about as the speakers were talking is that almost all of the papers were talking in some sense about our sort of untimely relationships with materialism and with material objects and with the material of our own subjectivity. And one of the questions that gets posed now in environmental humanities is about the status of the object and about the status of material. I was very interested to hear this. I feel like feminist theory has a really good relationship to thinking about materialism and I will just tell you, in the crudest possible way, which is, so you're reading, on the one hand, really abstract object-oriented ontologists like Timothy Morton. He's super, super smart. And then you're reading feminist new materialists like Stacey Alaimo, and she's super, super smart. And you're somewhere on the spectrum of this, trying to figure out how we tack back and forth between culture and materialism, how we take epistemology and ontology seriously in the same horizon of analysis. You start reading the object-oriented ontologists, and the parts of the object are withdrawn, and what does that tell us? And really, I'm the crudest theoretical thinker, because in my heart, what I'm really thinking is like, seriously, so many of us have just stopped being objects, and now you're super fascinated with being an object. Like, really, guy? You know what I mean? Like, you just realize that, like, when we talk about the new materialism, we have not yet finished with historical materialism. And so feminism has always given us, and queer of color critique has always given us a way to think about the historical formation of what we mean when we say materiality anyway. Like, who gets the privilege of theoretical abstraction? Who gets the privilege of a kind of historiographical relationship to virtuality and the circulation of images and the circulation of fantasies about personhood that are detached from the body? And I feel like almost all of the papers, in fact, all of the papers, really helped us to see that these questions are not just still urgent, they're enlivening. And I feel that after Trump, during Trump, in Trumpness, which I am bitter about and angry about every day, one of the things that feminist theory reminds me is that Trumpness means I am in a feminist theory workshop every day of my life. That is what I am doing. I am workshopping feminist theory. I am retailing it. I am circulating it. I am trying to embody it, and I'm trying to disembody it. But what he reminds me of, and what this workshop reminded me of, is that what we still have in an age of terrible scarcity is plenitude, right? And that we generate idea after idea, and anger after anger, and feeling after feeling, and affect after affect. And more than that, we generate history after history after history. We see what has been forgotten. We forget what has been privileged, and we do that purposely. And the reason that we generate all of these histories that are in conflict with each other at almost every moment in the most productive ways is because we therefore generate forgotten futurities that we work toward in our excess of feeling and thinking. For me, this is what feminist theory can tell us to do, to luxuriate and take pleasure in touching excess and plenitude in a terrible age of scarcity. So I thank all of the presenters for giving me those forgotten histories and those forgotten but still reachable futures. That's what I had to say. Thank you.
Awesome. I'm really sorry I said I'd go after that. That was beautiful. Thank you to my fellow panelists. Thank you to all of the organizers and everyone who's been here all these 2 days. I wanted to thank Kathy and Catherine for dwelling with horrible stuff, the management and the algorithm work, so that we don't have to. Much appreciated. I wanted to thank Amelia for walking us back through essentialism and what's there and what's problematic. And I wanted to thank Christina for living to tell us the tale. And so I have much less prepared than anyone else. I just want to collage some of what has passed through. I don't have a synthesizer. I guess I'm supposed to be that myself. So I've decided to take a little inspiration from Catherine around the music. Don't worry, I'm just gonna create little bits of song. You can sing along if you know the words, but it will be short, I promise. And to start, I just wanted to pull out a couple of phrases, epigraphs from the amazing, luxurious plenitude that we've been given over these past 2 days. The first is, what does it feel like? The second, an index of slightly horrifying knowledge. The third, dwelling made of not knowing which way to turn. And the fourth, tapping into the reservoir slumbering in the bosom. Oh, and I really do love the central cavity as a core image too, so we might return to that. So I'm just going to actually walk through some of the things that came to me from each of the papers and presentations we had today. And one, I think I feel a lot of nostalgia, as many people do, for the 70s and what came before. And one actually is, to hook into Kathy's work, is a line from Drew Carey, which was another moment of relation to work, where he says, there's a club for people who hate their jobs. It meets every day at 5 in every single bar in the world. As opposed to, I think we also see so many TV shows now where exactly what Kathy was representing, of like the place where you work is also the place where everything happens, and your love and your life is all there. So that captured really powerfully some of those popular culture experiences. There's also the very creepy management dreams of sort of harnessing all of our love, motivation, and energy towards a certain kind of productivity. And that's if you're lucky enough to have a job, right? And those of us who are pathetically grateful for employment and health insurance, still, yay. I really enjoyed and thought a lot with her work on subject construction, as opposed to, I think she took this from Ahmed, the affect alien, and sort of trying to think those things together feels really powerful. And then her urging us to push out of the individual romance story to the capacious communal future. Okay, so the first song. All right. Working 9 to 5, what a way to make a living. Ain't no getting by, it's all taken and no giving. They just use your mind. They never give you credit. It's enough to make you crazy if you let it. Okay.
Yeah. I thought hers was love and happiness. I kept on hearing Al Green, love and happiness, but no, yeah, love and happiness. Thank you.
Okay, so to turn to Christina, her pulling us into her talk through the story of the coal furnace and the gas and the fire, the snapping synapses, the grief and the pain and the loss, and yet the ongoing life. That image of the empty mouths and the spiral of losing and losing again. The contemplation of brokenness and the push to disaggregate a movement that is, on the one hand, so utterly important, and thinking through pride or the idea of heading somewhere, and yet that being clearly not enough. There has to be other ways. And the call towards something like universal design with the very clear sense that there are so many ways of being differently capacitated. Okay, so your song. I just have to stand up for this, sorry. André sul ponte vecchio, ma per buttarmi in arno mi strugo e mi tormento. Oh Dio, vorrei morir. Babbo, pietà, pietà. Babbo, pietà, pietà. Okay, so this one might be really obvious, but do 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 do. You got your mother in a whirl. She doesn't know if you're a boy or a girl. Hey babe, your hair's all right. Hey babe, let's go out tonight. Do do do. Sorry. So what I loved from Amalia's work was the idea of essentialism as essential and yet a bane. The movement towards the idea of a processing of sex differentiation with all of its instability and the hopelessness of excavating a core or a basis. That really powerful question, which has been taken up as well, about what about the right to desire to essentialize, and the idea of performing the fear you think you'll evoke. Okay, so the beautiful talk by Catherine about curiosities and number. All right, one more song. If Clarence took fair Gwendolyn out for an auto ride, and if at 60 miles an hour a kiss to capture tried, and quite forgot the steering gear on her honeyed lips to sup, how soon could 20 men with brooms sweep Claire and Gwenny up? Oh, 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 oh. Put down 6 and carry 2, la 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 la. Gee, but this is hard to do, la 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 la. You can think and think and think till your brains are numb. I don't care what teacher says, I can't do the sum. Which is to move into from a stupid song about, of course, death and horror on the road, to these questions that were raised so beautifully about how does one use numbers to prevent death if the whole sort of prefix of someone's life is that they are already killable. I really like the connection that Ara made through the Pima indigenous data, which drew me through Woolf on settler colonialism as well, and that way in which race becomes made through its targeting and the way that different people are targeted vis-a-vis their blood, vis-a-vis their labor, vis-a-vis their relation to land, and how that's always sort of undergirding these multiplicities. The call to think through the everyday of life, of joy, of love, of lament, as opposed to the swaths of death, to be okay with the unmeasurable, to try to dwell outside of the predictive, and to reorient to that monumental demand by getting on and with, not as a noun, but as praxis. And to end, I just wanted to pick up one thing that I found really suggestive in Amelia's work, which is the asterisk. With that sort of suggestion of something else, of a footnote, of an exception, of an addition, of a turbulence, of something that doesn't fit but is still connected. And I'm drawing from an old science fiction novel by Pat Cadigan where she has the graffiti, "You be the asterisk," just the sign. But when you open it up, of course, asterisk sounds like ass to risk. And we can go maybe with the with the central cavity being in another place, which would sort of get us into other places. But also just to think, even with the Affordable Care Act still here, of all of our asses being at risk in very intensive ways, even as that's very differential risks based on bodies. Not the same, but we are living in a time when enormous, enormous power is being aimed at those who are most vulnerable, immigrants, trans women, the ill, our ecosystems, on and on. So the calls for praxis that have been in all of these wonderful talks, I think, are absolutely essential if we're gonna survive. So thank you so much.
So the first thing I want to open it up to our presenters. Does anybody want to sing a song? The song goes first. Kathy, no. Okay. So I lost a mic. Do we have 2 mics? Okay, here, I'll do a mic too. Unless, do you want to anybody? Okay, that'd be great. Thank you. Thank you to our mic runners as well. They're very helpful. But so I'm wondering, so yay, mic runners. So can we ask you, is there some way you want to take up some of the commentary from the round table? I'm shifting. I'm slipping slowly. It was a slow shift. It was a pan and then a pan. Okay. All right. Just a polite gesture. I don't actually want to hear from you, but that was just a polite gesture. Okay. So our panelists and we just heard from the round table. So this is a chance for you to address the panelists, address the round table, add your own thoughts, questions, and things like that. So, starting over there.
Right, thank you. I will have a little reaction to the third presenter, Stephanie. And I'm just wondering, or maybe I'll stand up. I was just wondering what sort of level of comfort this event provided for you so that you can, kind of very generously dismiss an entire area of emerging feminist scholarship I keep having these experiences. So I just wanted to. I'm curious to. So you basically said that all of the lectures that you heard reignited the sort of kind of feminist political profile that you think we should have, and then you sort of juxtapose it to Triple O and people like Stacey Alamo, etc. So what I'm interested in is what sort of political comfort this event or events like that provide to crudely dismiss scholarship like that.
I'm sorry if it came off like that. Actually, that's the scholarship I'm working with. But one of the things that, and actually Stacey Alamo is one of my key sources, but one of the things that I've been thinking, and she is one of the great feminist environmental humanists, but one of the things that I've been thinking is we have recently in EH been trying to thread the needle between, and the most recent book by Graham Harman, for example, really talks about his distinction between Triple O and new materialism. And he really says that people like, Samantha Frost's work, like Sam Frost's work, and Stacey Alamo's work are much too folded in the social and too politically oriented. And that is actually where I would locate my stuff, because when you read Triple O, you get completely fascinated with the kind of idea that the life of the object is partially withdrawn from you. And that's actually a fascinating analytic point to put ontology back on the table. And yet, when you press it to go further toward historical materialism, they will make a break. And that's where I think that people like the new materialists, like Stacey and Sam Frost, have come back in and brought queer critique and queer of color critique, like Kate Sandilands is doing queer ecology and new materialism, and it's just fascinating work. So I apologize for having explained it too aggressively, but I'm actually seeing, for me right now, that the differences between Triple O and the kind of feminist new materialism are the most critical parts of EH, because it's there we can see the unequal distribution of toxicity and environmentalism across distributed bodies on the globe. Like my current project is on garbage. So I tack back and forth historically, and I tack back and forth globally, and I'm trying to work through scales of how we can imagine the relationship of the object, not just to itself in a Triple O way, but to unevenly distributed populations which bear the brunt of the consumer desire that creates most of the toxicity that they're dealing with. So, is that an answer? Oh, but well, why don't we talk afterwards? Okay. Sure.
Yeah.
I have a question. I can steal this. It's sort of come up in a couple of the talks. I was just wondering, especially because a couple of people in this room probably were in a class with Robin Wiegman about the object, and I was wondering about people's feelings about attachment to your object. And I know like a couple of people that spoke, I think Kathy and Catherine both had objects that they probably wouldn't prefer to be reading if it were otherwise. And so I was wondering how people feel about like loving your object, hating your object, having sort of dispassionate feelings towards your object. I find it very difficult to work with things that I don't care about, but then I find it very difficult to do anything other than describe things that I really love or just critique things that I really hate. So I was wondering what you guys had to say about that.
Can you field it?
Yeah, I think that one thing I learned doing my my dissertation research at the Library of Congress for the chapter I did on auction blocks, which made me like sick to my stomach, was I started painting. And my partner Ray Zilli, who I talk about a lot, and it's quite funny because he never comes up in my work. I sort of some people don't think he exists, but now he's like appearing more frequently. And he gave me paints for Christmas or something. But anyway, I started paint. But when I got the paints, that I said I can't do it, right? Like I can't. And he said you don't have to show anybody. And I was like, oh, right? Like this was a big thing for me. And I started painting auction block scenes and trying to create a different kind of relationship to that which I hate. So I think, and it's not, and they're not good paintings. They're terrible. But I added text to them, text and text of all these people that were put up and sold. And it helped me sort of do that work that I didn't want to do, but also express what was so difficult outside of the academic realm. So that's and I actually share this story a lot with students who work in you know with histories of racial violence and so on and so forth. It's like, is there any way you can, you know, do a song? No one has to listen, or they can.
Working with grief is difficult, and I think that the question of audience is a very real one. When I began writing, I had no idea that I was writing a book. I was writing out of a surplus of grief, and I know that it's absolutely a cliche to say that when you begin to write, you don't know where you're going. That's precisely why writing is such a hard discipline. You start a sentence, you're not sure where it's going to end. You start a paragraph, you're not sure where it's going. But I found in my training in language, the thing that helped me address the object, which was grief. So for me, language, the work of language and the work of the work of writing, the power of metaphoric thinking to start you one place and take you somewhere else, was all very, very important to me.
I guess I was trying to think what my object is, and I think my object is always capitalism, and I don't hate it. I just want to smash it. But I don't really think of it as, the love your work stuff was hard to read. But I mean, I don't really think of it as, I guess what I do is I work on, an archive of Marxist feminist theory that I really do like. And that really does bring me, inspiration and not passion, but those of us in our seminar. And so I guess my relationship is to Marxist feminist theory in some ways, even though my object is always capitalism. And so if, the latest instantiation of it or ideological support is happiness and loving your work, I'm quite happy to look at it. So I don't find that necessarily a burden.
So you are happy in your work? No. I always get way overinvested, and the worst part is that I start to know the people, and then it's even worse, and you can't. And that's the queer part for me, and it's how I've become queer, I think, is I feel honored to work on performances like the things I showed at the end, and with people who have changed the way I think about my own. Is this going on and off? No. The way I think about my own, gendered, sexed being in the world. So, yeah, but at least I try to kind of theorize that into what I'm doing, the fact that I love it too much.
Just like one quick thing. I
please.
was really intrigued by your question. And maybe it's because I work on so much stuff that's like super racist and super sexist and homophobic, that the idea that I might be, let's say, repelled by my object of study also presumes that I can get away from those feelings. And so I'm not sure I get to be able to get away from them. So in some ways, working on that stuff for me can replicate my relationship to the outside world. There's no necessarily, there's not always an out from those feelings. So which doesn't make working with those objects easier, but it makes it incredibly familiar in some ways.
Others on the round table?
I'll add to that too, because I keep thinking about Barbara Christian's point that even when you read something like the Turner Diaries, you're getting into someone else's mind, and what you're teaching students is how to realize their own limitations. And even if you get into the wrong kind of mind, you're still witnessing a world looked through an alternative lens, which is a way of opening people up to different kinds of thinking. And I find the biggest privilege of what we do is the possibility to think thoughts that I wouldn't otherwise have thought if I weren't pushing myself in some direction. So I think it's almost a complement or a adjunct to what Dershon is saying, but the learning process itself becomes the thing I love rather than the object.
Other folks?
Yeah, I'll add in. I think specifically, like if I'm doing feminist theory, there's a sense, I mean, I'm not lucky enough to have a gender studies department at my university, so I feel that I'm always, feminist theory is something I kind of do on the side, have an advisor that does feminist theory, but it's not something I get to spend most of my time on. So I feel like I've developed a relationship to the kind of canonical works in my discipline that that would be much more difficult to maintain without kind of feminist theory and queer theory as an analytic through which to read things. So for me, I think the disciplining of thought, as Catherine put it, is something that I have to deal with quite often in the discipline of political science. And yet feminist and queer theory kind of gives me the solace to read like lesbian stuff into Plato and still be okay in the academy. So I think there's a sense in which, the kind of perspective that we develop in feminist, queer, trans, critical race studies is something that helps me to kind of maintain attachments that I am imposed disciplinarily to maintain.
Yeah.
I might as well ask a question. Thanks, Jess. So I noticed, this is a personal interest of with regard to my work and myself, but I have noticed on several occasions that there is a way that artworks, works of art, aesthetic objects are being used as productive sites of knowledge production against theory. So your invocation of Howardita Pindell's work is really amazing. And actually, she's at Stony Brook University, so Kaji might know her. Maybe not. But I'm really intrigued by this. It's something that I'm interested in doing myself. And we were talking a little bit about it in our breakout group with regard to the relationship between the quantitative impulse of algorithms and statistics and how they create determination that has a deadening impact to it, and that there's something about life that's always indeterminate. And so I'm interested in the way that art keeps coming up, is sort of my question. I forgot that I'm at a conference that's not themed around art, to tell you the truth. So if people could talk about that.
I don't know. It doesn't seem to me that it came up in every talk, which was kind of a relief for me, actually. But there is this trope of art being a special space, which I keep looping around, and it came up in our group as well, that is kind of like, for me, true and not true. It's kind of like a heavily ideologically weighted fantasy that has distorted and perpetuated the racism of the art field and art history. But at the same time, I can't say I'm not kind of assuming that to be true when I bring up Vaginal Davis in my talk, that there is something that can be done. I guess I'm implicitly relying on that concept. So I would love to hear other people tease that out, because I'm too inside the art world and the art discourse. And I'm very, very suspicious of that idea.
I'll jump in and say, because I'm very, and I'm sorry. Do you want to go ahead and talk? Okay, I'll be brief, I promise. That I guess I'll say I don't think art is special. Like I'm not interested from a critical standpoint of saying art is this kind of special repository of knowledge. I'm more interested in trying to, in my own work at least, trying to think about what we might understand differently when we put art in conversation with something like theory, like that, and understanding the kinds of how art can help us think differently about theory, and then how theoretical bodies of knowledge help us better understand, that may or may not even be from the art historical field, might help us better understand the art object. So to me, it's about the conversations that are possible when we think about different kinds of text. So that's how I think. But it's not about, and I agree with you, about elevating that, put it on a pedestal, but it's about actually bringing it to the table. And as we talk about what counts as theory, which is why I asked, like, where is theory? Like, where are we looking when we're talking about the theoretical text? And what happens when an art object is one among many theoretical texts?
But that only makes sense if you haven't been in the art theory, art world for your entire career, where it's not brought into it. It's the only assumed object. So I'm fascinated now that really within the last maybe, I was out of the country, so I'm not sure, but when I got back, I was gone from 2003 to 2014, all of a sudden art was being brought into cultural studies, to ethnic study, much more than it ever had been. So something's happened where now it's seen as a vehicle. But in my field, it's not a vehicle, it's the assumed thing that one talks about. So that's why I'm so suspicious when it gets mobilized that way. But at the same time, I think we do it in art history, and that's why I'm so suspicious of it. So.
So this isn't necessarily an answer to that question, but I did want to note and also thank Diane for sort of breaking the mold and breaking out into song. That was quite a risk to do that. I appreciate that, and it made me think about the risk of doing something over which we don't have mastery, which can be also the position that Catherine was looking at when she said, "What if I just don't know?" Right, and how powerful that could be. And I wonder if when we're thinking about theorizing, because every time I come here, I've been here for like 10 years, and every time I come here, I feel like I know less and less and less and less, even though I'm getting more questions than answers than I've ever had. And I wonder if that's part of the where from which we theorize, is like thinking that I don't know the hell what's going on, so let me try to think about it a little more. And if we start from that space, then it is very risky, but also it might be a productive place for us.
I'm just riffing off of all of this. I wonder if the question is rephrased as in this way would be useful in any way. The aesthetic experimentation that's going on in many talks and even in the responses, and that's actually happened many times at this workshop in the past also. I'm wondering if it serves a kind of purpose akin to a kind of feminist speculation or experimentation in response to a certain set of political, intellectual, disciplinary crossroads that people might be responding to. Speculation itself is being colonized right now by a certain capitalist rationality, but what other modes of futurity or ways of messing with the boundaries or the limits? Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
I also wanted to just comment that in the field of Black studies, art has always been central, and cultural production has always been central, and interdisciplinarity has always been central, and it's always about sort of making connections. And part of that is to represent or sort of grapple with the brutal misrepresentation of Black people and humanize them through song, through visual art, through cultural production. So I think that I just wanted to note that it's always been there. It's always been a deeply, deeply interdisciplinary project. So if you look at Fanon, he's reading Richard Wright, right? He's reading Richard Wright. He's not just a psychiatrist. He's not just a doctor. And he's very, very interested in visuality and so on and so forth. And we can think of other scholars, but Fanon's my guy. So I think that that's something else I want to note, is that sort of bringing whether it be visual art, music, or other forms of art into the Black Studies project isn't new at all. It's the way that you humanize. So.
And I think also it's the plurality of knowing and the plurality of modes of knowing, right? Particularly when certain institutions are less inclusive. I would say I do see a difference in certain arenas of high art, what we used to call high art, being invoked. Because I would say cultural studies and a lot of these conversations have drawn on popular forms, but I think maybe Black studies was one of the places when we have, kind of like Howardina Pindell or the debates around Carol Wall. We have a whole bunch of things that come up that maybe helped actually make high art safe for other conversations in a way, maybe? I don't know, but there's others. Does anybody, is there anybody else who's working with, art or like sort of what we could call versions of art, not just, I guess maybe not or popular culture, but or popular forms of art, and thinking through how you work through them, maybe not just as an object, right, as some of what you're saying. It's not just an object that you're bringing your analysis to bear upon, but putting it much more in a similar field, maybe, with these other analytical approaches in your own work. I actually happen to know that you do that, but okay. Yeah, she's going.
Hi, I'm a first year in romance studies at Duke, so I'm at the very beginning of my projects, but I'm looking at the emergence of the actress as a professional figure in Renaissance theater. So looking at performativity on all the multivalent levels of already sexed bodies who are performing themselves, who are suddenly now performing the roles that were written for bodies that were understood to be sexed differently. Going from youths to actresses. And I'm sort of wondering, in a historical context, how not to fall into the trap of essentialism and how to understand bodies that can't speak for themselves anymore, that are lost to history, or not lost, but and that wouldn't understand themselves necessarily the way that feminist theory and queer theory and performativity theory have allowed us to reshape the way we think about bodies and gender and sex. So, I don't know.
Yeah, just to answer your question, I work on celebrity advocacy, and what I try to do is take what celebrity advocates do seriously without being condescending.
That's impressive.
Sorry?
That's impressive. I said that's impressive.
But
that's not work I could do.
They engage with issues that we also engage with as critical thinkers, and they do it also in a certain way, and will reappropriate certain words, give new meaning, new uses, or new understanding. And so in that sense, they also engage directly. And I'm thinking just post-feminism and feminism in amongst, and their use of, celebrity who say that they're feminists, and what does it mean? So yeah, that's my example.
I just wanted to address the art question that was just posed. I'm an artist from Australia, and I think the way that art and theory, I guess, work together is, I think within particular arts practices now, there's a return to the real of reality and lived experience. And I think that theory offers a really insightful understanding of what it is to be alive in the world. And so I think, within arts practice, you are seeing artists who are engaging with that. And part of what I'm interested in is how you, I guess, work with other people, work with people who don't necessarily have an arts practice, and how you talk about complex issues. And I think a way to talk about complex issues is by actually reading theorists like you all here who are trying to make sense of the world for us.
So we have one more sharing, one more comment.
So this might be super dense, like in terms of my own density, and I'm missing something. But I work in the field of literary studies, and I thought that the whole point of humanistic inquiry from the perspective of someone in literature is that we are using our objects to theorize, and theorizing, it travels, it circulates, and we apply it, and sometimes that application, the losing of the object that generated that theorizing can be really, problematic, to use a empty word. But, for example, queer temporality work was generated from the AIDS crisis, and queer temporality travels and circulates toward many other different kinds of objects, histories, communities, and ways that have been generative and useful. But so I guess I'm just, I don't know, it's interesting to hear this conversation, because I think that, when we think about the origins of our theory, they're often coming from objects, and they do get detached, but.
Yeah, I mean, this might be a conversation about the visual being different, but I would push back, and I would say something that I'm not convinced that new criticism was actually claiming that the literary text was producing the theory. I mean, I think that much of literary work those have been the objects to which you bring a certain theoretical apparatus. Not all, but just some of them, it is the object to which you bring the theoretical apparatus and you illuminate it. And I think that particularly for a lot of queer and feminist and Black studies work, the objects, I guess elevated is the wrong word, but I think people have created a mix where they're again creating a more horizontal field of this plurality of ways of knowing, in which the literary or the visual or the popular culture or Rihanna or whatever are in a mix, which is it's a very different model, certainly from a positivist model, but I think from this other model of I'm applying theory and illuminating this text. So I think that's some of it. But I do think that the visual is a different element than the literary.
That's true. Although you said, I guess, because the initial provocation was people working on art, and I mean that. So I guess it depends on your definitions, what counts as an object, and what are our objects, and art, how literary production as artistic production. But yes, that's why I don't think that.
Right. Well,
I don't think that texts are.
As the daughter of a writer and who's partnered with a writer, I actually steeped in the art world, I totally agree with you. But I was talking about or the question I was doing to try and sort of stimulate conversation late in the day, somewhat artificially and not totally successfully, was to say when the art itself is put in the same sort of, I'm using sort of science studies sort of language here of thinking of a symmetry, when it's placed in symmetrically with what gets constituted as theory. And I don't think that everybody discussing art, whether it's literary or visual or musical, does that. I don't think everybody does, and I think that there's a feminist and queer and Black and ethnic studies, there's rationales, or, well, in a good sense, there's reasons for why, in fact, that symmetry has developed, I think, in those fields, of reasons of being excluded from certain modes of knowledge, and reasons from really valorizing a plurality of modes of knowing. I don't know why this has become about me, and I feel.
All right, may I jump in really quickly? Just to say really quickly. So
Thank you.
I really appreciate your point, and I'll say, even if let's say you're completely right, that's something we're always doing, but even as you were talking, you were saying that we assume that the work is doing theorizing, but sometimes it gets detached. And I think that's precisely the moment I want to pause on, because that detachment that happens, two things. First of all, part of the work we need to do, the historical work we need to do, is undo that detaching, right? To think about that. But the second piece is, if that detaching happens, it happens in unsymmetrical ways to different groups of people in different ways. So even if it's happening and it's minor, it's not minor because it doesn't happen to every writer, every artist in the exact same way. And that's precisely what I think we need to attend to.
Okay, I think actually now we are going to turn it over to Priscilla for closing remarks. Thank you. Thanks very much to our roundtable presenters and to our mic runners.
I'll be very happy to know I do not have closing remarks. I have closing thank yous and announcements, which if I did not make, Pamela would be unhappy with me, which I don't want. So we will be circulating a survey, and we really, really, really want your feedback. So please take the time to do that. And please post any photos or whatever, thoughts, memories, whatever, on our Facebook page. That would be a great thing to do. So I want to say some, deeply, deeply felt thank yous. I want to thank all of the participants and workshop participants, and also the moderators who all did a phenomenal job. So, and a very, very deep thanks to the GSF staff, to Pamela and Julie and Kim, who's not here. And thank all of you for being here. This was really terrific and really fun, and stay in touch and come back.